policeman detains a boy who has just saved an elderly woman. But no one expected that something would happen next that would change everything. The brave act of a child turned out in a completely unexpected way, making many people reconsider their views. Thank you for watching us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you watch this video from. The spring air was alive, vibrant with colors and sounds that filled the park. Blossoms of red, yellow, and purple dotted the lush green of the landscape, and the fresh leaves on the trees moved gently in the breeze, reflecting the sunlight in a shimmering dance. It was a time of awakening, of hope, where everything felt like it was growing towards something new. The air was full of the sweet fragrance of flowers, and as the wind moved, it brought with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint aroma of food from families picnicking on the lawn. Birds called out from the trees, their songs a gentle chorus that added a melody to the atmosphere, blending with the rhythmic laughter of children, the barking of dogs, and the occasional rustle of a newspaper being turned by someone on a nearby bench. The park was full of life in every corner. A group of children played tag on the grass, their laughter loud and carefree as they zigzagged around each other, their feet brushing the grass in hurried steps. Near them, families sat in circles, their blankets spread across the ground, sharing sandwiches, juice, and stories. There were older couples, too, walking hand in hand along the paved pathways, their steps slow but steady, taking in the sights around them with a practiced appreciation. Artists were scattered along the park's edges, easels set up, their eyes focused on capturing the fleeting perfection of spring on their canvases. It was a scene of connection, where every individual added their own note to the grand symphony of life unfolding around them. Among the crowd, a boy stood alone, his eyes moving slowly over the scene before him. His name was Jaden. He wore a simple outfit, a well-worn pair of jeans and a faded t-shirt, practical, comfortable clothing that had seen many days like this. His hair was cropped close, and his bright eyes held a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he fit into this bright tableau of life. Jaden was 16, tall for his age with a lean build that hinted at strength, but there was something in his posture, a slight hunch of his shoulders that spoke of uncertainty. Jaden had dreams that were far larger than the life he currently lived. He wanted to be a doctor, someone who could help people, someone who could make a difference. It was an ambition that had grown within him ever since he was young, and it remained with him like a light he kept burning even in the most difficult times. But it wasn't easy. His family wasn't wealthy. His mother worked tirelessly to make sure he and his younger sister had everything they needed. She often reminded Jaden of the importance of education, of hard work, of making something of himself, and while her words were filled with love, they also carried weight, a pressure that Jaden sometimes felt crushed beneath. His mother believed in him more than anyone else did, but that belief came with expectations, and sometimes Jaden wondered if he could live up to them. He loved his mother deeply, appreciated everything she did for their family, but he couldn't help but feel the anxiety that came with wanting to meet her hopes. It was why he often came to the park, to clear his mind, to find some solace in the openness of nature, and to remind himself why he was pushing so hard. As Jaden watched the children playing, he felt a pang of longing. He wanted to join them, to laugh and play without worrying about the future, without carrying the weight of expectation on his shoulders. But as much as he wanted to move, his feet remained rooted in place. He had tried before, tried to step into those carefree games, but had been met with sideways glances, with whispered comments that made it clear that he wasn't welcome. He had always been different, and that difference had always kept him apart. Jaden watched as a group of boys no older than 10 or 11 ran past him, one of them accidentally brushing against his arm. The boy glanced back at Jaden, his expression shifting for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes before he turned away and continued running. Jaden felt the familiar sting of rejection, the fear that no matter what he did, no matter how kind or open he tried to be, he would always be an outsider. He turned his head, his eyes landing on an old woman sitting on a bench nearby. She was watching the children, too, a soft smile on her face. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a bun, and her eyes, though lined with age, held a warmth that was unmistakable. She caught Jaden's gaze and smiled at him, a gentle, welcoming gesture that made Jaden feel a little less invisible. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the bench. The old woman looked up at him, her smile widening. "Hello there, young man," she said, her voice soft but strong, carrying the weight of years and experience. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Jaden nodded, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, ma'am. It's really nice." She patted the bench beside her. "Come, sit with me. It's better to enjoy a day like this with company, don't you think?" Jaden sat down, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap. The woman looked at him with kind eyes. Her gaze seemed to see past the surface, to see the boy beneath. "You seem like you have a lot on your mind," she said after a moment, her tone gentle. Jaden shrugged, glancing down at his hands. "I guess, just thinking about stuff." The woman nodded. "I understand. Life can be heavy sometimes, can't it? Especially for someone as young as you." Jaden looked at her, surprised by the understanding in her voice. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It can be." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "My name is Margaret," she said. "And you are?" "Jaden," he replied, his voice a little stronger now. "Well, Jaden," Margaret said, her tone warm. "You know, when I was your age, I used to come to parks just like this one to think. I always found that the sound of the wind, the laughter of people, helped me put things into perspective, made the worries seem a little smaller." Jaden nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "I think that's why I come here too." Margaret reached out, patting his hand gently. "You're a good boy, Jaden. I can see that. And whatever it is you're struggling with, I want you to remember that you're not alone. There are always people willing to help, even when it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to ask." Jaden swallowed, her words resonating with him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so much time feeling like he had to carry everything by himself, like he couldn't let anyone see the cracks in his armor. But maybe he didn't have to. Maybe there were people, like Margaret, who could help lighten the load. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park washing over them. Jaden felt a calmness he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging that had always seemed out of reach. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, and it gave him hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Margaret turned to Jaden, her eyes twinkling. "You know, Jaden, the world needs more kind people like you, people who care, who want to help. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. You belong wherever you choose to be." Jaden looked at her, his eyes shining. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, nodding. "You're welcome, dear boy. Now why don't you go and try to join those kids again? Maybe today will be different." Jaden hesitated, glancing over at the children playing on the grass. A part of him wanted to stay in the safety of the bench, but another part of him, a braver part, wanted to try. He looked back at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Jaden stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and began walking toward the group of children, hope fluttering in his chest like a bird ready to take flight. The warmth of the spring day was beginning to fade as the sun slowly dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jaden stood near the group of children, his heart pounding in his chest as he gathered the courage to speak to them. He hesitated, his feet shuffling nervously, his mind filled with doubts that made his stomach churn. Before he could muster the courage to say anything, a sudden commotion drew his attention away from the children. His eyes darted toward the bench where Margaret had been sitting, and a sense of panic gripped him as he saw her struggling to breathe. Her face was flushed, her hand at her throat as she desperately gasped for air. The serene smile she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a look of fear that made Jaden's heart twist painfully in his chest. Without a second thought, he rushed over to her, his thoughts a frantic blur as he tried to think of what to do. "Margaret," he shouted, dropping to his knees in front of her. "What's wrong? What do you need?" Margaret's eyes were wide with fear, her voice barely a whisper as she choked out, "Inhaler, in my bag." Jaden's hands shook as he grabbed her bag from the bench, his fingers trembling as he tried to unzip it. The zipper got stuck for a moment, and Jaden felt a surge of frustration as precious seconds ticked by. He finally managed to get it open, his hands diving into the bag, searching for the inhaler. Books, a small camera, a wallet. He pulled each item out, tossing them aside in his frantic search. His breathing quickened as he realized he couldn't find it. He glanced up at Margaret, her breathing growing more labored, her face turning a deeper shade of red. Jaden's heart pounded painfully in his chest, fear gripping him with a force that made it hard to think. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not when she'd been so kind to him, not when she had given him hope. "Please, someone help!" Jaden shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as he looked around. The park, once filled with laughter and joy, now seemed to close in around him, the faces of the people blurring together as they turned to look at the scene unfolding. A few people stopped, their expressions a mix of concern and hesitation. Some murmured to each other, others simply watched, unsure of what to do. Jaden's eyes locked on a man standing nearby, his phone in his hand. The man looked at Jaden, then at Margaret, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Please, she needs help," Jaden called out, his voice breaking. The man hesitated for a moment, then started toward them, but the seconds felt like hours, each one ticking by with agonizing slowness. A woman approached, kneeling beside Jaden. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calm as she said, "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll help her." She reached into the bag, her hands much steadier than Jaden's, and within moments she pulled out the inhaler. Jaden felt a wave of relief wash over him, his entire body sagging as he watched the woman place the inhaler in Margaret's mouth. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes closing as the medication began to work. Jaden watched, his heart still pounding, as her breathing slowly began to even out, her face losing some of its redness. Tears stung his eyes and he blinked them away, a sense of overwhelming relief flooding through him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse as he looked at the woman who had helped. She smiled at him, a gentle expression that made Jaden feel a little less alone. "You did good, kid," she said softly. "You stayed with her, and you called for help. That's what matters." Jaden nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked back at Margaret, who opened her eyes and gave him a weak smile. Her hand reached out, and Jaden took it, holding it gently in his own. "Thank you, Jaden," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with gratitude. "You were brave." Jaden swallowed hard, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes soft. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what you need to do, even when you are." Jaden nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. He had been scared, terrified even, but he hadn't run away. He had stayed, and he had tried to help. Maybe that was what bravery really was. As the woman who had helped stood up, Jaden looked around, noticing the small crowd that had gathered. Some people were murmuring to each other, their eyes on Jaden and Margaret. He could hear snippets of their conversations, some expressing relief that Margaret was okay, others wondering why it had taken so long for anyone to help. There were even a few who whispered things that made Jaden's stomach twist, comments about how he had probably been the cause of the commotion in the first place. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Margaret, who was now breathing more easily. But the words stung, a reminder of how quickly people could judge, how easily they could see the worst in him without knowing anything about who he was or what had happened. It was a feeling Jaden knew all too well, one that had followed him for as long as he could remember. "Let's get you some water," the woman said, helping Margaret to her feet. Jaden stood as well, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He stayed close to Margaret, his eyes darting around, half expecting someone to come over and accuse him of something. He hated that feeling, that constant sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to see him as a threat instead of just a kid who wanted to help. As they made their way to a nearby bench, Jaden noticed a police officer approaching. The officer was tall, with a stern expression that made Jaden's heart skip a beat. He recognized the uniform, the authoritative stride, and his stomach tightened with a familiar dread. The officer, whose name tag read McGregor, stopped in front of them, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He looked at Margaret, then at Jaden, his gaze lingering on the young boy for a moment too long, suspicion etched in his features. "What's going on here?" McGregor asked, his voice gruff. Jaden opened his mouth to explain, but his voice caught in his throat. He glanced at Margaret, who was still catching her breath, and then at the woman who had helped, hoping she would speak up. But before anyone could say anything, McGregor's eyes locked on Jaden, his expression hardening. "You," he said, his tone accusatory, "what were you doing here?" Jaden's heart pounded, his mouth suddenly dry. I was helping her," he managed to say, his voice trembling slightly. McGregor's eyes narrowed further, his gaze cold. "Helping her, huh? You sure about that?" Jaden felt his stomach twist, the fear he had felt earlier returning with full force. He knew that look, knew what it meant. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind about him, who saw him as a problem rather than a person. "Officer, he really was helping," the woman said, stepping forward, her voice firm. "The lady had an asthma attack, and this young man did everything he could to assist her." McGregor barely glanced at her, his focus remaining on Jaden. "We'll see about that," he muttered, pulling out a small notepad. "Name?" "Jaden," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last name?" McGregor pressed, his pen poised to write. Jaden hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the way McGregor looked at him made him feel like he had. He glanced at Margaret, who was watching the exchange with a worried expression, and he took a deep breath. "Miller," he said finally, his voice steadying as he spoke. McGregor scribbled something down, then looked back at Jaden, his eyes cold. "You stay right here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jaden nodded, his heart heavy. He watched as McGregor walked away, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and anger. He had only tried to help, but now it felt like he was being treated like a criminal. It wasn't fair, but Jaden knew better than to argue. He had seen too many situations like this end badly, and he wasn't about to make things worse. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's going to be okay, Jaden," she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. Jaden looked at her, her kind eyes giving him a small measure of comfort. He nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. He just hoped she was right, that everything would be okay, even though it felt like the world was stacked against him. The sun had set, and the park that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer as dusk settled in. The once bright colors of spring had dulled, and Jaden felt the chill of the evening settle into his bones. He remained on the bench beside Margaret, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The children who had been playing nearby were gone, their parents having hurried them away when the police officer arrived, and the crowd that had gathered had begun to disperse, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Jaden could still see Officer McGregor standing a few feet away, his back turned as he spoke into his radio. Every so often, McGregor's eyes would flick back to where Jaden sat, suspicion still etched deeply into his features. Jaden looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He had done nothing wrong, but the way McGregor looked at him made him feel like he had. It was like being caught in a nightmare, one where everything he did, no matter how well-intentioned, seemed to be twisted into something wrong. Margaret gave Jaden's arm a gentle squeeze, her voice soft as she said, "Jaden, don't let this get to you. You did everything right." Jaden forced a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know," he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand why this is happening." Margaret sighed, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Jaden's chest tighten. "Sometimes people see what they want to see, not what's really there," she said quietly. "But you have to remember that their perception of you doesn't define who you are. You know what you did, and that's what matters." Jaden nodded, though the words did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He wanted to believe Margaret, wanted to believe that the truth would be enough, but the way Officer McGregor kept glancing at him made it hard to hold on to that belief. He watched as McGregor finished speaking into his radio and began walking back toward them, his expression still stern. "All right," McGregor said, his tone brusque as he stopped in front of Jaden and Margaret. "We're going to need you to come down to the station, kid." Jaden's heart sank, his eyes widening in disbelief. "The station? But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help her." McGregor's gaze hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's not for you to decide," he said, his voice cold. "Now get up. We need to get this sorted out." Margaret struggled to her feet, her hand still resting on Jaden's arm. "Officer, this is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Jaden was helping me. I had an asthma attack, and he did everything he could to make sure I was okay." McGregor barely looked at her, his focus remaining on Jaden. "We'll get your statement at the station, ma'am," he said curtly. "But right now, I need the boy to come with me." Jaden felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes stinging as he looked at Margaret. He didn't want to go. He hadn't done anything wrong, and the thought of being taken to the police station filled him with a deep, paralyzing fear. He had heard stories about people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, about how quickly things could go wrong. He didn't want to be one of those stories. Margaret looked at Jaden, her eyes filled with worry. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, McGregor grabbed Jaden's arm, pulling him up from the bench. The sudden movement made Jaden stumble, his heart pounding in his ears as he tried to steady himself. "Hey!" Jaden protested, his voice cracking. "You don't have to pull me like that." McGregor ignored him, his grip tight as he began leading Jaden away. Margaret called after them, her voice shaky, but McGregor didn't slow down. Jaden looked back at her, his eyes wide with fear. He could see the worry etched on her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached out toward him, and it made his heart ache. "I'll be okay," Jaden called out, trying to sound brave, though his voice wavered. "Don't worry about me." Margaret nodded, though her eyes were still filled with fear. Jaden tried to focus on that, on the fact that she believed in him, that she knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But as McGregor led him away, the reality of the situation began to sink in, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. The walk to the police car felt like it took forever. Jaden could feel the eyes of the people in the park on him, could hear the whispers that followed him as he was led away. He wanted to shout, to tell them that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he had just been trying to help. But the words stuck in his throat, and all he could do was keep his head down, his heart pounding in his chest. McGregor opened the door of the police car, pushing Jaden inside. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in Jaden's ears. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the fear was overwhelming. He was alone, trapped in the back of a police car, and he had no idea what was going to happen next. The drive to the station was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Jaden stared out the window, his mind racing. He thought about his mom, about how worried she would be when she found out what had happened. He thought about his sister, about how he had promised her that he would always be there to protect her. And he thought about Margaret, about the kindness she had shown him, and how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. When they arrived at the station, McGregor opened the door, pulling Jaden out of the car. The station was busy, officers moving back and forth, phones ringing, the air filled with a sense of urgency. McGregor led Jaden through the station, his grip still firm on Jaden's arm, until they reached a small room with a table and a few chairs. "Sit," McGregor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jaden sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. McGregor stood by the door, his eyes never leaving Jaden. The silence in the room was heavy, the air thick with tension. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to think of what to say, of how to explain what had happened. The door opened, and another officer walked in, a folder in his hand. He glanced at Jaden, then at McGregor, his brow furrowing slightly. "This the kid?" he asked, his voice low. McGregor nodded. "Yeah, found him in the park. Claims he was helping an old lady, but we need to get the full story." The officer nodded, sitting down across from Jaden. He opened the folder, his eyes scanned the papers inside before he looked up at Jaden. "All right, kid," he said, his tone more measured than McGregor's. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Jaden took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. "I was in the park," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I was just sitting there, and then I saw Margaret, the old lady, having trouble breathing. She said she needed her inhaler, so I tried to help her find it. That's all I was doing, I swear." The officer nodded, his eyes studying Jaden's face. "And what happened after that?" Jaden swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I found her bag, but I couldn't find the inhaler. I started calling for help, and then this lady came over and found it. She helped Margaret, and then Officer McGregor showed up and brought me here." The officer glanced at McGregor, who was standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He turned back to Jaden, his eyes softening slightly. "Okay, Jaden," he said, his tone gentler now. "I just need you to stay calm, all right? We're just trying to get to the bottom of this." Jaden nodded, though his heart was still pounding. He wanted to believe the officer, wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up soon. But the fear remained, a constant presence in the back of his mind, reminding him of how quickly things could go wrong. The door opened again, and Jaden's heart lifted for a moment as he saw his mother step into the room. Her eyes were wide with worry, her face pale as she looked at him. "Jaden!" she exclaimed, rushing over to him. She pulled him into a tight hug, her arms trembling as she held him close. Jaden closed his eyes, the familiar scent of his mother's perfume filling his senses. He clung to her, his fear finally breaking through as tears welled up in his eyes. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help." His mother pulled back, her eyes filled with tears as she cupped his face in her hands. "I know, baby," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you didn't do anything wrong. We're going to get this sorted out, okay? Just stay strong." Jaden nodded, his heart aching as he looked into his mother's eyes. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But as he glanced over at McGregor, who was still watching them with that same cold, suspicious gaze, he couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. The air inside the police station felt heavy, almost suffocating. The small room where Jaden sat with his mother felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in around them as they waited. Jaden's mother held his hand tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. The officer who had questioned Jaden earlier had left the room, leaving them alone with Officer McGregor, whose cold gaze never left them. Jaden could feel the weight of McGregor's eyes on him, a constant reminder of the suspicion that clung to the situation like a dark cloud. Jaden's mother, Angela, tried her best to stay calm, but Jaden could see the fear in her eyes, the way her breath hitched every so often, the tension in her shoulders. She had always been the rock of their family, the one who held everything together no matter how difficult things got. But now, sitting in that small, cold room, Jaden could see the cracks, could see how much this was affecting her. "It's going to be okay, Mom," Jaden said softly, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. His voice wavered, the uncertainty clear. He wanted to be strong for her, to show her that he wasn't scared, but the truth was, he was terrified. Angela looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "Jaden, you shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I don't understand why this is happening." Jaden swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't understand it either. All he had done was try to help Margaret, but somehow everything had spiraled out of control. He thought back to the way McGregor had grabbed him, the way the officer had looked at him, as if he were guilty of something just because of who he was. It wasn't fair, but Jaden knew that fairness had little to do with situations like this. He had seen it happen before, had heard the stories from friends and family, stories of people being treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. The door to the room opened, and another officer stepped inside. He was older, his face lined with years of experience, and his eyes held a kindness that was absent in McGregor's gaze. He gave Angela a small nod before turning his attention to Jaden. "I'm Sergeant Daniels," he said, his voice calm. "I just want to ask you a few more questions, all right?" Angela's grip on Jaden's hand tightened, and Jaden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted this to be over, wanted to go home and forget that any of this had happened. He just wanted things to go back to normal. Sergeant Daniels pulled out a chair and sat down across from them, his eyes gentle as he looked at Jaden. "I know this has been a difficult situation, and I want you to know that we're just trying to get to the truth," he said. "Can you tell me again what happened in the park? From the beginning?" Jaden took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He recounted the events again, how he had seen Margaret struggling to breathe, how he had tried to help her find her inhaler, how he had called for help when he couldn't find it. He told Sergeant Daniels about the woman who had helped, about how relieved he had been when Margaret finally got her inhaler. He tried to keep his voice steady, but it trembled slightly, the fear and frustration leaking through. Sergeant Daniels listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving Jaden's face. When Jaden finished, Daniels nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Jaden," he said. "I believe you." Jaden's heart lifted slightly at those words, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. But before he could say anything, McGregor, who had been standing silently by the door, scoffed, his arms crossed over his chest. "You believe him?" McGregor said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Come on, Daniels. We both know how these things go." Daniels turned to look at McGregor, his expression hardening. "I think we need to be careful about making assumptions, McGregor," he said, his voice firm. "This young man was trying to help someone in distress. We have witnesses who can corroborate his story." McGregor's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jaden. "Yeah, well, we'll see about that," he muttered, his tone filled with disdain. Angela's eyes flashed with anger, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My son is not a criminal," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that still lingered. "He was doing the right thing. He deserves to be treated with respect." Daniels nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at Angela. "You're absolutely right, ma'am," he said. He turned back to Jaden, giving him a small, reassuring smile. "We're going to get this sorted out, Jaden. I promise you that." Jaden nodded, though the fear still clung to him, a heavy weight in his chest. He wanted to believe Daniels, wanted to believe that this nightmare would soon be over. But the way McGregor looked at him, the way the officer's eyes seemed to see only what he wanted to see, made it hard to hold on to that hope. Daniels stood up, giving Jaden and Angela a nod. "I'm going to make a few calls, see if we can speed this along," he said. "In the meantime, just sit tight." As Daniels left the room, McGregor lingered for a moment, his eyes still on Jaden. There was something in his gaze, something cold and unyielding that made Jaden's stomach twist. He had done nothing wrong, but McGregor looked at him like he was already guilty, like nothing Jaden said or did would ever be enough to change his mind. When McGregor finally left, Angela let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. She turned to Jaden, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pride. "You're so brave, Jaden," she said softly. "I know this is scary, but you're doing everything right." Jaden nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to be brave, wanted to be strong for his mother, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him, whispering that no matter what he did, it might not be enough. He had tried to help, had done everything he could to do the right thing, but it still wasn't enough to keep him from ending up here, in this small, cold room, treated like a suspect. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Jaden's mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and anger and confusion. He thought about Margaret, about the way she had smiled at him, the kindness in her eyes. He thought about the moment she had started struggling to breathe, the fear that had gripped him as he realized she needed help. He had acted on instinct, had done what he thought was right, but now, sitting in that room, he couldn't help but wonder if he should have done something differently. A knock on the door pulled Jaden from his thoughts, and he looked up as the door opened again. Sergeant Daniels stepped inside, a small smile on his face. "Good news," he said, his tone warm. "We've spoken to the witnesses and everything checks out. You're free to go, Jaden." Jaden's heart skipped a beat, relief flooding through him. He looked at his mother, who let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. Tears filled her eyes, and she pulled Jaden into a tight hug, her arms wrapped around him as if she never wanted to let go. "Thank you," Angela whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Daniels nodded, his eyes kind. "I'm just sorry this happened in the first place," he said. "You shouldn't have had to go through this." Jaden pulled away from his mother, his eyes meeting Daniels. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for believing me." Daniels gave him a small nod. "Always," he said simply. "Now let's get you two out of here." As they left the station, Jaden felt a mixture of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sadness. He had been lucky this time, had found someone who was willing to listen, to believe him. But he knew that not everyone was that lucky. He knew that there were others who had been in his position and hadn't made it out as easily. The thought weighed heavily on him, a reminder of the world they lived in, a world where people like him were often seen as guilty until proven innocent. Outside, the night air was cool, a gentle breeze ruffling Jaden's hair. He took a deep breath, trying to let go of the fear that had gripped him for so long. His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with love and pride. "You did good, Jaden," she said softly. "You did everything you could." Jaden nodded, though the weight of what had happened still lingered. He had tried to do the right thing, had tried to help, and it had almost cost him everything. But as he looked at his mother, at the love in her eyes, he knew that he couldn't let this stop him. He couldn't let fear keep him from being the person he wanted to be. "Let's go home," Angela said, her voice gentle. Jaden nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, "let's go home." It had been a few days since Jaden was released from the police station, but the events of that night lingered in his mind like a shadow that wouldn't let go. He tried to return to his normal routine, attending school, doing his homework, and helping out around the house. But everything felt different now. There was a heaviness that hung over him, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could go wrong. He had tried to do the right thing, but it had almost cost him his freedom, almost branded him as something he was not. Jaden's mother, Angela, had tried her best to help him move on. She encouraged him to talk about his feelings, to let out the fear and frustration that had built up inside him. But it wasn't easy. Jaden didn't want to burden her with his fears, didn't want to make her worry more than she already did. So instead, he kept most of it to himself, letting the weight of it settle in his chest, where it seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. On a bright Saturday morning, Jaden found himself back at the park, the same park where everything had happened. It was quieter now, the early hour keeping most people away. He walked along the paved path, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the familiar sights. The memories of that day played in his mind. Margaret struggling to breathe, his frantic search for her inhaler, the way Officer McGregor had looked at him, the cold suspicion in his eyes. Jaden clenched his jaw, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him stubbornly. As he walked, Jaden noticed a small group of people gathered near the entrance of the park. They were holding signs, their voices carrying across the otherwise quiet space. He frowned. Curiosity piqued as he made his way closer. When he got near enough, he realized what was happening. A small group of protesters had gathered, their signs reading messages like "End Police Discrimination" and "Justice for Jaden." Jaden's heart skipped a beat, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He hadn't expected this, hadn't realized that the story of what had happened to him had spread beyond the people who had been in the park that day. He stood at the edge of the group, his eyes scanning the faces of the protesters. There were people of all ages, young, old, black, white, all standing together, their voices united in a call for justice. "Jaden!" a voice called out, and he turned to see his friend Marcus making his way toward him, a broad smile on his face. Marcus was holding a sign of his own, the words, "We stand with Jaden," painted in bold letters across it. "Hey, man," Marcus said, clapping Jaden on the shoulder. "I was hoping you'd come by. We've been out here for a couple of hours now. People are really fired up about what happened." Jaden blinked, still trying to process what he was seeing. I didn't know about this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yeah, well, word got around. People are tired of seeing stuff like this happen, Jaden. What happened to you wasn't right, and people want to make sure it doesn't happen again." Jaden looked down at the ground, his emotions a tangled mess. He felt a surge of gratitude for the people who had come out to support him, but there was also a part of him that felt exposed, vulnerable. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted to be the center of attention. He had just wanted to help Margaret, and now here he was, a symbol of something much bigger than himself. "Come on," Marcus said, giving him a gentle nudge. "You should say something. People want to hear from you." Jaden hesitated, his stomach twisting with anxiety. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, wasn't sure if he had the right words to say, but as he looked at the faces of the people gathered there, their eyes filled with hope, with determination, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been through what he had, all the people who had been judged, mistreated, simply because of the color of their skin. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath, Jaden stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod, and the crowd quieted as Jaden cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice shaky. I'm Jaden. I want to thank you all for being here. I didn't expect this, but it means a lot to see so many people who care about what happened." He paused, his eyes drifting to the ground for a moment before he looked up again. What happened to me in the park that day? It wasn't right. I was just trying to help someone, and I ended up being treated like a criminal. And I know I'm not the only one this has happened to. There are so many people who go through things like this every day, and most of the time, no one hears about it. Jaden's voice grew stronger as he continued, the words coming more easily now. We shouldn't have to be afraid just because of the way we look. We shouldn't have to worry that someone will see us as a threat just because of the color of our skin. I know I can't change the world by myself, but maybe if we all stand together, we can start to make a difference. Maybe we can show people that we're more than the stereotypes they see. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jaden felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride and hope. He looked at Marcus, who was grinning from ear to ear, and then at the other people gathered there, their faces filled with determination. For the first time since that day in the park, Jaden felt a sense of empowerment, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. As applause died down, a voice called out from the crowd, "Jaden, you're a hero!" Someone shouted, and Jaden felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what he thought was right, and it had almost ended in disaster. But as he looked at the faces of the people around him, he realized that maybe being a hero wasn't about being fearless or perfect. Maybe it was about standing up, even when you were scared. Maybe it was about trying to do the right thing, even when the world seemed determined to see you as something you weren't. Jaden stepped back, Marcus giving him a pat on the back. "You did great, man," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. People needed to hear that. Jaden nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Marcus," he said quietly. I want things to be better for all of us." "And they will be," Marcus said firmly. "We just have to keep fighting." As the protest continued, Jaden found himself talking to more people. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who had heard his story and wanted to show their support. Each conversation helped to lift the weight that had been pressing down on him, each kind word a reminder that he wasn't alone. There were people who believed in him, who believed in a better world, and that gave Jaden the strength to keep going. Later that day, as the sun began to set, Jaden stood at the edge of the park, watching as the crowd slowly began to disperse. Marcus stood beside him, his sign resting against his shoulder. Jaden took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. "You know," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful, "I think this is just the beginning. People are waking up, Jaden. They're starting to see what's really going on, and that's because of you." Jaden looked at his friend, his eyes filled with emotion. "I hope so," he said softly. "I just want to make things better, for everyone." Marcus nodded, a smile on his face. "And you will," he said. "We all will. Together." As they walked away from the park, Jaden felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. The events of that day in the park had changed him, had opened his eyes to the reality of the world he lived in. But they had also shown him that he wasn't alone, that there were people who were willing to stand with him, to fight for what was right. And as long as he had that, Jaden knew he could face whatever came next. The protest at the park had sparked something in the community, something powerful and unstoppable. In the days that followed, there was a growing momentum, a movement that seemed to sweep through the neighborhood like a long-awaited wind of change. Jaden could feel it in the way people looked at him when he walked down the street, in the way they smiled, nodded, or even stopped to offer a few words of encouragement. It was like people had been waiting for a reason to speak out, and now that they had one, there was no going back. Jaden found himself at the center of it all, not because he wanted to be, but because people were drawn to his story, drawn to the idea that someone like him, someone young, someone who had faced injustice, could be a catalyst for change. He had never imagined himself as a leader, had never thought he would be someone people looked up to, but now it seemed that was exactly what was happening. And as much as it scared him, it also gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt before. One afternoon, as Jaden was leaving school, he was approached by a group of his teachers. They were standing by the main entrance, their expressions serious but supportive. Mrs. Thompson, his history teacher, stepped forward, her eyes meeting Jaden's with a warmth that put him at ease. "Jaden," she said, her voice calm but filled with determination, "we've been talking, and we think it's time we address what's happening. Not just what happened to you, but the bigger picture. The issues that have been affecting our community for far too long." Jaden blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson exchanged a glance with the other teachers before turning back to Jaden. "We want to hold an assembly," she said. "We want to talk about racial discrimination, about prejudice, and we think it would be powerful if you were willing to share your story, to help people understand what it's like from your perspective." Jaden's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of fear and pride swirling inside him. The idea of standing in front of the entire school, of sharing something so personal, was terrifying, but at the same time, he knew how important it was. He knew that if he could help even a few people understand, if he could make even a small difference, it would be worth it. I'll do it," Jaden said, his voice steady despite the nerves that twisted in his stomach. "If it can help, I'll do it." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Thank you, Jaden. This means a lot to all of us." The assembly was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Jaden found himself feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He spent hours in his room, going over what he wanted to say, trying to find the right words to convey everything he had felt, everything he had experienced. He wanted to be honest, wanted to make people understand what it was like to be judged, to be seen as a threat just because of the color of his skin. But he also wanted to give them hope, wanted to show them that change was possible, that they could all be a part of making things better. The day of the assembly arrived, and Jaden stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened to the murmur of the students gathering in the auditorium. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to push away the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for everyone who had ever felt the way he had, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Mrs. Thompson stepped up beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You ready?" she asked, her voice soft. Jaden nodded, though his stomach was in knots. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready." Mrs. Thompson gave him an encouraging smile before stepping out onto the stage. She spoke briefly, her voice carrying through the auditorium as she introduced Jaden, explaining why they were there, why it was so important to talk about these issues. And then she turned to Jaden, giving him a nod. Jaden took a deep breath and stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him for a moment as he faced the crowd. He could see the faces of his classmates, his teachers, all watching him, waiting. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the reason he was there. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice shaky at first. "I'm Jaden, and I'm here today because I want to talk about something that's really important. I want to talk about what happened to me and about what it means, not just for me, but for all of us." He paused, taking another deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. "A few weeks ago, I was in the park, and I saw an elderly woman who needed help. She was having trouble breathing, and I did what I thought anyone would do. I tried to help her, but instead of being seen as someone who was trying to do the right thing, I was treated like a criminal. I was questioned, taken to the police station, all because someone assumed that I was doing something wrong." Jaden's voice grew stronger as he continued, the words coming more easily now. "And the thing is, this isn't just about me. This is about how people like me, people of color, are often seen as a threat even when we're just trying to help. It's about the assumptions that people make, the stereotypes that they hold on to, and how those things can have real consequences." He could see the expressions on the faces of the students in the crowd. Some were nodding, others looked thoughtful, and a few looked uncomfortable. But they were listening, and that was what mattered. "I know that not everyone here has experienced what I have," Jaden said, his voice softening. "I know that some of you might not understand what it's like to be judged because of the way you look. But I hope that by sharing my story, I can help you see things a little differently. I hope that maybe the next time you see someone who looks different from you, you'll take a moment to think before you judge, to remember that we're all just people, trying to live our lives, trying to do our best." Jaden paused, his eyes scanning the crowd once more. "And I also want to say that even though what happened to me was hard, it also showed me something important. It showed me that there are people who care, people who are willing to stand up and say that this isn't okay. The protest at the park, the support I've gotten from all of you, it's given me hope. Hope that things can change, that we can make things better if we work together." The auditorium was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a few people, and then it grew, until the entire room was filled with the sound of clapping. Jaden felt a lump form in his throat, emotion welling up inside him as he looked out at the crowd. He had been scared, had doubted himself, but now, standing there, he knew that he had done the right thing. As Jaden stepped off the stage, Mrs. Thompson was there to meet him, her eyes shining with pride. "You were amazing, Jaden," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You made a difference today." Jaden hugged her back, a smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me." Mrs. Thompson pulled back, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Always," she said softly, "and remember, this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, people who are brave enough to speak up." Jaden nodded, her words sinking in. He knew that there was still a long way to go, that there were still so many things that needed to change. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He knew that he wasn't alone, that there were people who believed in him, who were willing to stand with him, and as long as he had that, he knew he could keep going. As Jaden left the auditorium, he was met with smiles, with words of encouragement from his classmates and teachers. He could see the impact his words had made, could feel the change in the air. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. And that was enough for now. The days following the school assembly were filled with a new sense of purpose. Jaden found himself busier than ever, attending meetings, talking with teachers, and helping to organize events aimed at raising awareness about racial discrimination. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything felt almost too much to bear, days when he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. But every time he saw the impact his efforts were having, every time someone came up to him to thank him for what he was doing, it gave him the strength to keep going. One day, Jaden received an unexpected phone call. It was from the mayor's office. The mayor, a middle-aged man named Charles Bennett, had heard about what had happened to Jaden and wanted to meet with him. Jaden was surprised, unsure of what to expect, but he agreed. He knew this was an opportunity to make a real difference, to take the conversation to a higher level. The meeting was set for a sunny afternoon at City Hall. Jaden arrived with his mother, Angela, who had been by his side every step of the way. They were led to a large, bright office where Mayor Bennett greeted them warmly. He was a tall man with a kind face and an air of authority that made Jaden feel both nervous and hopeful. "Jaden, it's a pleasure to meet you," Mayor Bennett said, extending his hand. "I've heard a lot about you, and I have to say I'm impressed with what you've done." Jaden shook his hand, a small smile on his face. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I just want to make things better for everyone." The mayor nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "I understand that, and that's why I wanted to meet with you. I've been thinking a lot about what happened to you and about what we can do to prevent something like that from happening again. I want to hear your ideas, Jaden. I want to know what you think we can do to make our community safer and fairer for everyone." Jaden took a deep breath, his mind racing. He hadn't expected the mayor to ask for his input, but now that he had the opportunity, he knew he couldn't waste it. He thought about everything that had happened, about the fear he had felt, the way he had been treated, and the changes he wanted to see. "I think we need more training for police officers," Jaden said, his voice steady. "Training that helps them understand the communities they're serving, that helps them see people as individuals, not just stereotypes. I also think we need more opportunities for young people to connect with law enforcement in positive ways. If we can build trust, maybe things like what happened to me won't happen as often." Mayor Bennett listened intently, nodding as Jaden spoke. "Those are good ideas," he said, "and I think you're absolutely right. Building trust is key. I've been considering starting a community outreach program, something that would bring police officers and young people together in a positive environment. Would you be interested in helping to get something like that off the ground?" Jaden's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and excitement flooding through him. "Really? You want me to help?" The mayor smiled. "Absolutely. You're a leader, Jaden. People look up to you. I think you could make a real difference." Jaden glanced at his mother, who was smiling at him, her eyes filled with pride. He turned back to Mayor Bennett, nodding. "I'd love to help," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever I can do, I'm in." The meeting continued for another hour, with Jaden, Angela, and Mayor Bennett discussing ideas for the outreach program and other initiatives aimed at addressing racial discrimination and building stronger community ties. By the time they left City Hall, Jaden felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. This was real change. Change that could make a difference not just for him, but for everyone in the community. A few weeks later, the community outreach program was officially launched. It was called Bridging the Gap, and its goal was simple: to bring together young people and law enforcement in a positive, supportive environment. The first event was held at the park, the same park where everything had happened. It felt like coming full circle, like a chance to rewrite the story of that place. to turn it into something good. Jaden stood at the edge of the park, watching as people began to arrive. There were police officers in uniform, but they weren't there to patrol. They were there to connect, to listen, to be a part of the community. There were families, children, teenagers, all coming together to take part in something that felt hopeful, something that felt like a new beginning. Marcus was there too, a wide grin on his face as he approached Jaden. "Man, look at this," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "This is amazing. You did this, Jaden." Jaden shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "We did this," he corrected. "All of us." The event was a success. There were games, activities, and conversations, real conversations where people listened to each other, where they shared their stories and their experiences. Jaden watched as a young boy talked to one of the officers, his eyes wide with curiosity, as the officer knelt down to his level, answering his questions with patience and kindness. He saw families laughing together, saw people who might never have spoken to each other before now sharing a meal, breaking down the barriers that had once kept them apart. Margaret was there too, sitting on a bench, her eyes filled with warmth as she watched everything unfold. Jaden made his way over to her, a smile on his face as he sat down beside her. "Look at all this," Margaret said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Jaden nodded, his eyes scanning the park. "Yeah," he said softly, "it really is." Margaret turned to him, her eyes shining. "You did a good thing, Jaden. You turned something painful into something beautiful. Not everyone can do that." Jaden felt a lump form in his throat, emotion welling up inside him. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You were the one who told me to never give up, to keep trying." Margaret smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. "And you listened. That's what makes all the difference." As the sun began to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, Jaden looked out at the park, at the people who had come together to be a part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't the end. There was still so much work to be done, so many challenges to face. But it was a start, a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. Jaden knew that he couldn't change the world on his own, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his friends, his family, his community, all standing with him, all ready to fight for a better future. And as long as he had that, he knew that anything was possible. He had faced fear, had faced injustice, and had come out stronger. He had found his voice, had found his purpose, and now, as he looked out at the faces of the people around him, he knew that this was just the beginning. A beginning filled with hope, with determination, and with the promise of a better tomorrow. It was a rebirth, not just for Jaden, but for the entire community. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Jaden smiled, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspirational stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click the bell so you don't miss new videos. See you in the next episodes.